About 5 hours into my time playing Unplugged on the Oculus Quest 2, I couldn't really decide if I was having fun or not. I'd been playing it for an extended period of time, I kept returning to it, and when I wasn't playing it, I was certainly thinking about it, but really couldn't nail down why I didn't love it. And I think the reason is that Unplugged is a great concept, something that really can work in theory, but right now it's just not really its time. Unplugged likes to refer to itself and frame its gameplay around it being an air guitar simulator. It basically tries to take the physical act of playing an air guitar and layering that underneath an actual game. But really, Unplugged is just Guitar Hero for the Oculus Quest. There is a note lane, like in Guitar Hero. Notes come down, and in time to the music, you must hit the notes by strumming your fake guitar. But instead of pressing buttons, you're performing all of these actions using your hands. You don't use the standard Oculus controllers, instead Unplugged uses the headset's hand tracking tech. You strum and hit notes using nothing but your bare hands. And in theory, this is a really cool way of constructing a Guitar Hero-like game in VR. Using the controllers would have been clunky and weird, and the resulting visual effect of using your hands to imitate playing a guitar, well, it works. It really does look like you're playing air guitar, which is the entire point of the game. Notes are represented by 4 different colours, each colour representing a finger that has to be on the fretboard. There are 4 quadrants on the lane, and you move your dominant hand up and down the fretboard, repositioning your fingers to hit the notes correctly. It's a good facsimile for the Guitar Hero note system, with the difference here being that you have to physically move your fingers all the way up and down the fretboard, as different note combinations aren't specific to different quadrants on the lane. Most of the time you hit notes by strumming the guitar with your other hand, however there are a few different notes that require you just to hit them with your fret hand, and you don't have to strum to complete them. On the game's easiest difficulty, there aren't that many note combinations to worry about, and the game adds additional layers of complexity both in terms of note combination and note type on higher difficulties. In general, 90% of the time, I'd say Unplugged works. In fact, it works better than I was expecting it to. For starters, the lane and the fretboard is constantly attached to your dominant hand, so you don't have to worry too much about that, and the rest of the guitar can be positioned and locked in place before you start every song, meaning you always do kind of know where you need to strum, and you're not getting too lost in the middle of a song. Although it's lacking the physical sensation of holding a plastic guitar, which I do think was kind of integral to the appeal and success of Guitar Hero, Unplugged goes a long way to making you feel like you are playing a real guitar. The majority of the fantasy of being a rock and roll superstar is in the actions of moving your hand up and down a fretboard, playing fake chords, and strumming away to some rock classics. However, and this really is the main issue with Unplugged, it just sometimes doesn't really work. The Oculus hand tracking tech is pretty good. It knows where your hands are to a pretty accurate degree as long as they're within the range of the headset's external cameras, but this tech, while it may work for selecting inputs on a menu or scrolling through a web browser, doesn't feel accurate enough to be used as the primary input method for a game. If you move your head to the left too much to try and focus on the note lane, it'll stop tracking your other hand and it won't register you strumming at all. So you kind of have to make sure that both your hands are constantly in your view, even though the game itself kind of doesn't really accommodate for that much. I spent most of my time carefully positioning the guitar before I even started a song to try and work out whether or not the headset itself would be able to track both of my hands accurately enough that I wouldn't miss any notes. And on easy difficulty, it kind of feels like the game accommodates this. There's not that many notes, you can take your time, and when you're trying to change your fingers around to hit specific notes, the gap between the notes is long enough that the headset can understand what your fingers are doing. Like I say, it's not one-to-one tracking, there's a slight delay, but on higher difficulties, it really becomes apparent that the headset tech just isn't in line with the speed and precision required by a game of this caliber. As the songs become more complex and you're playing on hard difficulty, you'll just be hitting against a constant wall of failures while the headset itself just can't keep up with the speed your fingers have to move. And frustration begins to set in incredibly quickly, especially because when it works, it really does work and it feels fantastic. I think if the game was structured to allow you to play around with its entire library of really good songs, the song selection here is fantastic. You have everything from old school hits to modern gems. It really does feel in a lot of ways like a true successor to Guitar Hero. However, the game's campaign requires you to bump up the difficulty really quickly to the point where I actually couldn't progress past the middle portion of the game. It wanted me to try and get a 5-star score on a song on hard, and I just couldn't get the game to track me accurately enough to even have a chance of completing a song on hard, never mind getting 5 stars. And it was so frustrating because I wanted to keep playing Unplugged. I was just aware that I wasn't ready or in the right conditions to play it on hard yet. The game is fundamentally aware, too, of its own limitations. It asks you to make sure your sleeves are rolled up, to clean your camera's sensors, and to play in a very well-lit room. In fact, it reminds you of this before you start every song. And for the most part, it works fine. Well, for 90% of your time with it. The issue is that 10% where it doesn't work really sticks with you. In a lot of ways, it kind of feels like playing a Kinect game or a game on the Nintendo Wii that didn't quite have its motion controls implemented correctly. But here's the thing about Unplugged. I kept playing because that core idea of using your hands in a virtual reality space to play a guitar in a rhythm game was fascinating. Unplugged is a really polished and well-constructed game. Other than the control scheme issues and that weird difficulty spike when it comes to progressing through the game's campaign I mentioned earlier, everything just feels super polished. The game's tutorial is really good at onboarding you into how to play the game. The fact that the note lane is connected to your hand and moves with you is a really smart bit of design. The stages are pretty simplistic, but it follows that Guitar Hero model of each one being slightly larger than the last, and in virtual reality, these small spaces that become wider and more filled with shadowy figures gives it a real sense of grandeur. And the overall presentation, the tone of the thing, is really well realized. It leans into rock as a glamorous power fantasy, almost in the same way that the original Guitar Hero games used to. Your guide through the game's tutorial is one of the members of Steel Panther, from my understanding a band that literally just celebrates the concept of rock, which is fitting for a game that is kind of doing the same thing. He speaks to you via FMV sequences through the means of a poster, and it's silly and it's fun and it's very self-aware and winking and nudging you in the side, but it works because it's a game about playing air guitar, and that's kind of the joy of that, right? Is the make-believe, it's the pretend, the sense of fun and play. It works, and it's supported by the soundtrack, which has a couple of newish rock songs in there, but mainly the big hitters are things like The Clash's Should I Stay or Should I Go, and of course Lynyrd Skynyrd's Freebird. I've played a fair amount of games in virtual reality now, and for me the ones that stand out are the games that don't necessarily try to just move a pre-existing genre into virtual reality for the sake of doing it, but games that examine and try and reimagine how these things might work in this completely different arena. What does a genre look like on a console that's all about immersion and increased interaction? Unplugged could have just used the Oculus controllers. You could have pressed buttons to hit notes and used motion controls to strum the guitar, but the developers knew that wouldn't have felt the same. Air guitar is an instantly recognizable action, something that most of us have probably done, embarrassingly, in the shower. And they looked at this weird experimental aspect of the Quest. Hand tracking is not, in my experience, used that often in games on the system, but they tried, and they made an exceptionally well put together game around that core concept because it serves the fantasy that the game is trying to provide. The issue is that the core technology isn't quite there yet, but the game is. if Facebook ever release a Quest 3, something that has better sensors and better detection when it comes to hand tracking, Unplugged will go from being a fascinating curio with multiple frustrations related to its core gameplay to something pretty much essential for people who love rhythm games or have fond memories of Guitar Hero and are looking for an experience that's similar on a completely new format. So I can't really sit here and recommend Unplugged for anyone other than maybe people who want that experience now and are willing to overlook the frustrations that they will hit with this game in its current form. But in a couple of years, when the technology improves and new models and new features are released, yeah, I don't know. It just feels like there's something here and it's just not quite ready yet. But absolutely fair play to the developers, because in those moments when Unplugged works, when it really feels like you're stood on a stage as the sole guitarist blasting out these classic tunes, it feels really, really good. And I absolutely have to give credit where credit is due, because in those moments I was having an absolute blast. Alright, well, thank you for listening to this unscripted opinion dump about the game Unplugged. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more indie reviews, and I'll be back next week. Thank you, as always, for watching.